I was always very lively and, with among my friends.
Hollywood is filled with untold stories, and James Garner has just brought one to light that has been buried for decades. It traces back to the set of The Great Escape, the 1963 war epic that became a cultural landmark. But behind the camera, tensions were brewing, particularly between Garner and a rising star named Charles Bronson. For years, Garner kept quiet, refusing to stir the pot, but now he is speaking out. What he shares about Bronson is both surprising and deeply personal. What sparked the conflict? Why did the resentment linger for so long? And what moment nearly pushed them into a physical confrontation? Stay tuned to find out. James Garner's story plays out like a gritty coming-of-age drama set against the backdrop of some of America's toughest years. Born in Norman, Oklahoma during the Great Depression, his early life was anything but easy. His father, Weldon Bumgarner, owned a hardware store and did what he could to keep the family going. But tragedy struck early. When James was just 4, his mother, who was half Cherokee, passed away. Years later, James would reveal his heartbreaking belief that she died due to a botched abortion. Not long after, tragedy struck again when Weldon's hardware store burned down. With his business gone, Weldon turned to laying carpets to earn money. But along with the new job came a worsening drinking problem, and the home turned into a place of fear. He would come home drunk and force his boys to sing for their dinner. If they refused, they would be beaten. Things got so bad that Weldon eventually split up the kids, sending each son to live with different relatives. It seemed like he knew he could not handle being a father. Then Weldon remarried and called the boys back home. That should have been a good thing, but it was not. The new stepmother, Wilma, whom Weldon nicknamed Red, turned out to be even more violent than he was. She beat the boys with branches they had to prepare themselves. James took the brunt of it. On top of the physical abuse, Red humiliated him by forcing him to wear her dresses and makeup just to mock him. By his early teens, James had reached his breaking point. At 14, during one of Red's attacks, something snapped. He fought back, pinned her down, and began to strangle her. His father had to pull him off. James would later admit that if his dad had not stepped in, he might have killed her. After that terrifying moment, Weldon did what he always seemed to do: he left. This time he abandoned his kids completely, and James had to fend for himself. Despite everything, James did not crumble. He dropped out of high school and at 16 lied about his age to join the Merchant Navy right as World War II was winding down. But the ocean was not kind to him. He got terribly seasick and left soon after. Back on land, he took whatever jobs he could find: gas station attendant, carpet layer, even underwear model. That modeling gig gave him his first tiny taste of show business. By 1950, James found himself in Los Angeles living with his dad again. It was his second time in the city, and he was still wandering, trying to figure life out. Then came the Korean War. Because he was technically still an Oklahoma resident, James became the first person from the state to be drafted. He was sent overseas with the 5th Regimental Combat Team of the 24th Division and spent 9 brutal months in combat. His war stories were like something out of an action movie, except they were real and they were painful. On just his second day in Korea, he was hit by shrapnel in his hand and face. Later, in a tragic case of friendly fire, U.S. planes mistook his unit for the enemy and opened fire. James got hit in the rear and scrambled for cover. As he tried to climb out of a foxhole, he fell off a cliff, injuring his shoulder and making his already bad knees worse. He would later say the military saw him as just one more body to fill the gap. Even in the middle of combat, James' quirk shone through. One night on guard duty, he caught a whiff of garlic in the air, and that smell made his stomach churn. He hated garlic even more than onions. He could detect it in the tiniest amounts, even if a pan was not washed properly. That night, the smell warned him that North Korean or Chinese troops were nearby. He passed the word down the line, and thanks to his sensitive nose, his unit was ready. After the war, James returned to Los Angeles and fell back into odd jobs. At one point, he was laying carpets again, this time alongside his dad. He also pumped gas at a local station, and it was there that fate stepped in. He met a man named Paul Gregory, who told James he was starting a talent agency. Paul thought James had the look to be an actor. James did not think much of it at the time. Years later, James spotted Paul's name on the door of a talent agency and decided to stop in. That unplanned visit turned into a game changer. Paul took a chance on him, landing James his first real acting gig, a role in the stage production of the Caine Mutiny Court-Martial. Fast forward to 1957, and James Garner was on fire. That year, he starred alongside Marlon Brando in Sayonara and made his big splash on television as Brett Maverick, the smooth-talking, sharp-witted gambler in the hit series Maverick. The show followed Brett and his brother Bart as they drifted through the Wild West, chasing fortune, danger, and the occasional poker showdown. Garner played Brett, and Jack Kelly took on Bart, with the two swapping lead duties episode by episode. Right from the start, it became obvious that James Garner was the standout. His cool, easygoing style mixed with sly humor made him a fan favorite. He was not your typical gunslinger cowboy. He was clever, charming, and did not always win his fights with fists or firepower. For the first few seasons, everything was going great. Garner was becoming a household name, carving out a strong place for himself in the booming Western genre. But then came 1960, and with it a major roadblock. The Writers Guild of America went on strike, and Hollywood production came to a standstill. Maverick, like most shows, stopped getting new scripts. The problem for Garner was that he had signed a 52E contract with Warner Brothers. He was only making $1,250 a week, which was not much considering how successful the show had become. The studio decided that since there were no scripts, they did not have to pay him. That did not sit well with Garner. Tired of being treated like a pawn in the studio's game, James Garner took a stand. He sued Warner Brothers for breach of contract and he won. The court ruled in his favor, making it clear the studio could not just freeze his paycheck during a strike. Warner Brothers tried to patch things up with a new deal, but Garner had made up his mind. He wanted freedom, the kind that meant choosing his own roles, his own path. So he walked away from Maverick, but that was not the end of the road for him or for fans of the show. Then came 1963. The Great Escape hit theaters and exploded into one of the most iconic war films of its era. It had everything: a daring prison break, a pulse-pounding storyline, and a cast that read like a who's who of Hollywood heavyweights. Leading the charge was none other than Steve McQueen, the undisputed king of cool. The film turned him into a certified movie star. But while the action on screen was intense, the real drama was happening behind the camera, especially between two of the film's key players, Charles Bronson and James Garner. At the time, Bronson was not yet the big-screen tough guy he would later become. He was still climbing the Hollywood ladder. Garner, on the other hand, was already riding high off his success in the TV show Maverick. So when these two came together on set, you would think there would be some mutual respect. But according to James Garner himself, that could not be further from the truth. Apparently, things between Bronson and Garner were tense from day one. Garner would go on to describe Bronson as cold, standoffish, and in his words, a mean man. The friction was so bad that Garner kept telling stories about how difficult Bronson was for decades after the film wrapped. When Bronson passed away in the early 2000s, Garner used his autobiography to finally unload all those behind-the-scenes memories, painting a picture of a man who was not just hard to work with, he was downright hostile. But Bronson was not Garner's only issue on set. Even his friend Steve McQueen, the film's breakout star, was not spared. Garner admitted that McQueen's ego got a little out of control during filming. Still, while Steve might have had his diva moments, Garner eventually chalked it up to passion for the role and let it go. Bronson, though, that grudge lasted a lifetime. Now it is worth looking at the cast dynamics to really understand why things got so messy. McQueen was the golden boy and Garner was the TV star stepping confidently into film. Bronson, meanwhile, was the guy who still had something to prove. Surrounded by big names, maybe he felt like he had to puff up his chest just to keep up. And puff up he did, reportedly acting like a top-billed star when he very much was not. Garner suggested Bronson's attitude did not come from dedication to the role but more from a desire to dominate the set, and that rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. One story Garner shared years later really summed it all up. After filming wrapped, he invited Bronson over for a friendly poker night. It was probably a peace offering or maybe just one last attempt at civility. But things quickly went south. Bronson tried to back out of a bet he had already placed, and not just with Garner but with a young stagehand who could not afford to lose that kind of money. Garner was not having it. He stood up for the kid and insisted Bronson pay the $50 he owed. That is when things got heated. Bronson flew into a rage and the two nearly came to blows. That was the last time Garner ever invited Bronson over. From that point on, their feud was set in stone. The tension did not end when The Great Escape became a hit. Charles Bronson vowed never to work with James Garner again, and he was not bluffing. But fate had other ideas. Years later, the two men found themselves at dinner together, each with his wife. Lois Clark with Garner, Jill Ireland with Bronson. The women hit it off instantly, chatting like old friends. The men, not so much. Garner and Bronson sat stiffly, barely speaking, just trying to get through the evening without reigniting their off-screen feud. But for James Garner, the most remarkable chapter was still ahead. In 1974, The Rockford Files hit TV screens and it did not take long to become a breakout hit. But this was not your typical detective show. It had a distinct edge, a style all its own. James Garner stepped into the role of Jim Rockford, a private eye with a rap sheet, a rundown trailer on the beach, and a knack for landing in trouble most people would dodge. And he did it all with charm, wit, and that now iconic gold Pontiac Firebird purring along for the ride. What made the show stand out was how different Rockford was from the typical action heroes of the time. He was not slick, he was not flashy. He was scrappy, relatable, and always just a little down on his luck. And the best part, Garner insisted on doing all his stunts. Whether it was barreling through high-speed car chases or throwing punches in parking lots, he wanted to keep it real. That meant no stunt doubles, just Garner, a car, and a whole lot of grit. Now the thing about the Rockford Files is that it leaned more into car chases and clever plot twists than gunfights. But those stunts, they were no joke. Garner had been honing his driving skills since his early film days, and by the time Rockford rolled around, he was a pro behind the wheel. But as the seasons rolled on, the physical toll of doing all those stunts started to catch up with him. His knees, his back, everything started to wear down. By the time they reached the 6th season, his doctor gave him some hard news. He needed to slow down. Garner realized something big then: if he couldn't be the guy doing the stunts, he couldn't really be Jim Rockford anymore. And NBC knew it too. Without him front and center, there wasn't much point in keeping the show going, especially with production costs piling up. On top of all that, Garner was dealing with more than just physical pain. He was in a legal fight with NBC, trying to get a share of the profits from reruns. At the same time, he underwent serious heart surgery. It was a rough patch both professionally and personally, but it showed just how much he had put into making the Rockford Files a success. And speaking of success, the show was not cheap to make. That Firebird got wrecked so often during filming that they had to replace it several times each season, not to mention the cost of repairs after nearly every episode. Add in the rising budget from guest stars and more ambitious scenes, and NBC was feeling the financial strain. Still, the show had a charm that people could not get enough of. One of the fan-favorite quirks was the answering machine gag at the start of every episode. Rockford never picked up his phone. Instead, you would hear a different, often hilarious voicemail each time. Coming up with new jokes every week got so tricky that the writers started taking suggestions from anyone working in the NBC building. Behind the scenes, there was also some serious talent in the mix. David Chase, who would go on to create The Sopranos, wrote for the show. The catchy theme music was from Mike Post, the same guy who later gave the world the Law and Order theme. Even with all the behind-the-scenes drama and the toll it was taking on him physically, the Rockford Files stayed a major hit. For James Garner, it was not just a return to TV, it was a statement. After Maverick, this was proof he still had the charm, the grit, and that undeniable spark. But unlike his younger days, doing his own stunts started to wear him down. Over time, the injuries piled up, and eventually, it was not just his health. Rising production costs added to the pressure. The result, the show came to an end not because fans stopped watching, but because it simply became too much. Still, Garner was not ready to slow down. Even into the 2000s, he kept showing up and showing off. In the year 2000, he starred alongside Clint Eastwood, Donald Sutherland, and Tommy Lee Jones in Space Cowboys, a movie about a crew of retired astronauts called back into action to fix an old Cold War-era satellite. The film was a fun mix of action, humor, and nostalgia, with 4 Hollywood legends playing characters who, despite their age, were still more than capable of saving the day. Behind the scenes, though, things were not quite as smooth as they looked on screen. The spacesuits the actors had to wear were apparently a nightmare, stiff, heavy, and incredibly hard to move in. Tommy Lee Jones, the youngest of the group at 53, complained about how uncomfortable they were. And it was not just talk. Donald Sutherland actually fell backward in his suit and cracked his knee, and James Garner, who was 72 at the time, took a spill himself and dislocated his shoulder during a scene. But here is the thing: despite the injuries, both Sutherland and Garner kept on filming. In a moment that sounds more like a movie than real life, it was Clint Eastwood who jumped in to help. He gave Garner some on-the-spot first aid and even popped his shoulder back into place. Turns out, Clint had his history with shoulder dislocations from a film he did in the 1970s, so he knew exactly what to do. Garner, being the tough guy he always was, did not head home to rest. He finished filming that day. Though Eastwood later admitted it took him much longer to get back to golfing after dealing with his own shoulder issues. What is more, Garner never blamed the accident on his age. He brushed it off as nothing more than clumsiness. In fact, the only time he acknowledged that he and the rest of the cast might not be in their prime was during one particular scene where the characters had to bare their backsides. Sutherland later joked that he desperately looked around for something to cover himself up, but there was nothing. He laughed about how gravity had done its thing by then. Over the years, though, Garner paid the price for always insisting on doing his stunts. Years of action scenes and physical comedy led to chronic injuries, especially to his knees and back. By the time he reached his later years, those injuries had piled up. He went through multiple surgeries, including knee operations during every break he took from acting for 5 years straight. Eventually, it got to the point where he had to stop doing stunts altogether. And it was not just his knees and back. In 1988, Garner underwent heart surgery to clear a blockage. In 2008, he had another operation after suffering a mild stroke. Playing Jim Rockford for 6 intense seasons took a serious toll. Still, he powered through it all with the same grit and determination that made him a star. When asked why he finally stepped back from the Rockford Files, Garner explained that one injury had set off a domino effect. One thing led to another. Limping on one leg hurt the other. His back went out. Medication upset his stomach. And eventually, even his mood took a hit. It was the kind of slow breakdown that comes from pushing your body for decades without pause. On top of that, he battled a sinus problem that lingered for 4 years. It was caused by a bone growth blocking one of his sinuses, and not even medication helped. It was just another thing he had to live with, always uncomfortable, always there. Many believe that anxiety played a role in his health issues too. In the 1970s, during a particularly stressful stretch in his career, he suffered from ulcers and even separated from his wife for a while. Garner admitted that during those breaks, he spent time bouncing between Canada and a rented home in the valley. But he was quick to point out that the separations were not due to problems in the relationship, they were caused by the pressures of his work. Eventually, Garner and his wife reconciled, and they remained together until his death in 2014. He passed away at the age of 86 from a heart attack. His wife followed 7 years later in October 2021. Through it all, James Garner never stopped being that mix of toughness, humor, and heart that made audiences love him for decades.